The house on Maple Hollow Road. If you ever buy a house for less than half its market value, ask why. I didn't. I had 3 weeks to move my family out of an apartment we could no longer afford, a wife who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me in a month, and a real estate listing that seemed to answer every prayer I hadn't said out loud. 4 bedrooms, 2 acres, a wraparound porch, listed at a price so low I assumed it was a typo. It wasn't a typo. It was a warning, written in a language I didn't know how to read yet. By the time I learned to read it, my daughter had stopped sleeping in her own room, my wife had started talking to someone I couldn't see, and I had found out exactly why the Kessler family sold that house for $1 to the county in 1987, and why no one had lived in it since, until us. My name is Daniel Ashworth. I'm telling you this because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened in that house, and because the official record, the one filed with the county, the one that says no findings of foul play, is a lie, built on top of a lie, built on top of a much older lie. I'm going to tell you everything in order, because the order is the only thing that made it make sense to me eventually. Even now, sitting in a hotel room, 3 states away with the lights on, and the television playing static filled nothing, just so the room isn't silent, I still catch myself checking the corners. So bear with me. It gets bad. It gets much worse. Before it gets anywhere close to over. We moved to Maple Hollow Road in the 2nd week of September. My wife, Renee, had found the listing at 2 in the morning, during one of the nights she couldn't sleep, which by then were most nights. She woke me up holding her phone so close to my face that I flinched. "Look at this," she said. "Look at this, Danny." The photos showed a Victorian farmhouse, pale yellow with white trim, set back from the road behind a stand of old maples that had probably been saplings when the house was built. The listing agent's description was strange in a way I didn't clock at the time. Heavy on square footage and acreage, oddly silent on history, silent on why a house that size, that close to town, that recently renovated according to the photos, was priced at $94,000. "It's probably a scam," I said. "It's a real listing. I called the agent already." That should have told me something. Renee wasn't a 2 in the morning phone call kind of person before that autumn. She'd become one gradually, the way water becomes ice. Not all at once, but by degrees so small you don't notice until you're standing on something solid that used to be a river. We drove out the next Saturday. Maple Hollow Road is 15 minutes outside of town. One of those roads that starts as pavement and ends as gravel, and then, if you keep going, ends as nothing at all, swallowed by trees. The house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, and even from the road I felt something I couldn't name. Not dread, not yet. Just a kind of pressure, like the air near the house was thicker than the air behind us. The listing agent was a heavy-set man named Gary Prell, who met us in the driveway with a folder of paperwork and would not, at any point in the entire hour we spent with him, go past the front porch. "Storm damage inside," he said, when Renee asked why he was staying outside while we walked through. "Insurance thing. I've seen it already. You two go ahead. Take your time." That should have told us something too. Instead, we walked through a house that was, on its surface, beautiful. Restored hardwood floors, crown molding in every room, a kitchen that had clearly been renovated within the last 5 years with granite counters and cabinetry that still smelled faintly of sawdust. My daughter Molly was 7 at the time, and she ran ahead of us up the stairs, her sneakers slapping against the wood, laughing at nothing in particular the way kids do when they're excited and don't yet know to be careful. "Mom, there's a room up here that's already got a bed in it!" Renee and I exchanged a look. We climbed the stairs and found Molly standing in a small bedroom at the end of the hall, 3rd door on the left, empty, except for a single twin bed frame with no mattress, pushed against the far wall under the window. The wallpaper was a faded pattern of small blue flowers peeling slightly at the seams. "Can this be my room?" Molly asked. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because it seemed like such a normal, uncomplicated request. The kind kids make about 100 times a year. "Can I have ice cream? Can we get a dog? Can this be my room? I had no idea that I was standing in the room where 40 years earlier, a 9-year-old girl named Abigail Kessler had died in her sleep of what the coroner's report called undetermined causes, and that her parents, and then her older brother, and then the 2 families who'd tried to live there after the county took the house back, had all eventually sold it or lost it or fled it one after another in an unbroken chain of people trying to get away from something in that room. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my daughter had smiled for the first time in weeks, standing in that room, and that felt, at the time, like the most important fact in the world. We bought the house 11 days later. The first month was fine. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important for you to understand that whatever was in that house did not announce itself. It waited. It watched us unpack boxes and hang curtains and argue about paint colors, the way you'd watch a family of strangers move into your childhood bedroom, if you were the kind of thing that could watch and wait and remember. The first sign, the first one I let myself notice anyway, came in early October. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of a child's laughter coming from downstairs. Not Molly's laughter. Molly was asleep in her room. I checked. This was a different laugh, higher, thinner, with an edge to it that made the hair on my arms stand up before my conscious mind had even processed what I was hearing. I went downstairs. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The laughter had stopped the moment my foot hit the bottom stair, cut off so cleanly it was like someone had pressed pause on a recording. I told myself it was the pipes. Old houses make sounds. I'd read that somewhere, some article about why old houses creak and groan, something about wood contracting in the cold. I did not, in that moment, connect creaking wood to distinct sound of a child laughing, because my brain was doing what brains do when they're protecting you from a conclusion you're not ready for. It was building a bridge out of nothing, just so I'd have somewhere to put my foot. Renee mentioned it 3 days later, unprompted over coffee. "Did you hear a kid laughing the other night?" she asked. "Downstairs." I felt something cold move through my chest. "You heard it too." I thought it was Molly at first, but she was asleep. We didn't say anything else about it. I want you to understand that this is the thing nobody tells you about living in a haunted house. And I use that word now with full confidence, though at the time, neither of us would have said it out loud, not even to each other, not even in a whisper at 3 in the morning with the lights on. Nobody tells you that the horror isn't the sound itself. The sound is almost bearable. What isn't bearable is the moment you realize your spouse heard it too, and that means you can't file it away as a dream, or a trick of a tired mind, or a pipe settling in the cold. 2 people hearing the same impossible thing means the impossible thing is real. And once you cross that line, there's no walking back across it. You can pretend. You can go days, weeks without mentioning it again. But, Molly started sleepwalking in the 3rd week of October. I woke to find her standing at the top of the stairs, perfectly still, facing the 3rd door on the left, her own bedroom door, which was closed. Her eyes were open. She was not looking at me when I said her name. She was looking at the door. "Molly!" Nothing. I walked toward her slowly, the way you'd approach a dog you didn't know the temperament of, and when I got close enough to touch her shoulder, she spoke, in a voice that was hers but wrong, flattened, like she was reading words off a page she couldn't quite see. "She wants to know if I can stay." "Who does, baby?" "The girl in my room." I carried her back to bed. She woke up fully the moment I laid her down, blinking at me with her normal 7-year-old confusion. No memory of the hallway, the stairs, or what she'd said. I sat on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep, and then I sat there for another hour after that, watching the closed closet door and the dark rectangle of the window, because I did not trust either of them not to move. I didn't tell Renee that night. I told myself I was protecting her. The truth, which took me a long time to admit, is that I was protecting myself from having to say the words out loud, from having to hear myself describe our daughter standing at the top of the stairs with her eyes open and someone else's voice coming out of her mouth. Saying it would have made it a fact instead of an incident, and I wasn't ready for facts yet. Things escalated the way they always do in these stories, which I know now because I've since read every account I could find of families who lived in haunted houses looking for some kind of pattern, some rule book, anything that would have told me what to do differently. They escalate slowly, and then all at once. A sound becomes a shape becomes a touch becomes a name. In November, Renee began finding things moved. Not dramatically. Nothing was thrown across the room. Nothing was written on the walls in the kind of message you see in movies. It was subtler than that, and somehow worse for being subtle. A chair pulled out from the kitchen table, 6 inches, every morning, no matter how carefully we pushed it back in the night before. The bathroom mirror fogged over when no one was showering, and once, only once, Renee swore she saw letters starting to form in the fog before she wiped it away with her sleeve, too frightened to read what they said. I started sleeping badly, which for me meant not sleeping at all. I'd lie in bed and listen to the house the way you'd listen to a person breathing next to you, trying to determine, from the rhythm of the sounds, whether they were awake. Around 1 in the morning most nights I would hear footsteps in the hallway. Small ones, a child's stride, moving from the direction of Molly's room toward the stairs and then stopping. Renee heard it too most nights. We started leaving the hallway light on. It didn't stop the footsteps. It just meant we could see, in the gap under our bedroom door, when a small shadow passed by. I want to tell you about the night everything changed, because up until that night, we were still telling ourselves a story where this was survivable, where we could live alongside whatever this was, the way you'd live alongside a strange neighbor, keeping a respectful distance, staying out of each other's way. That story ended on the 17th of November. I woke at 3 a.m. It was always 3 a.m. I'd come to understand that this house, or whatever inhabited it, operated on that hour with a punctuality that felt almost administrative, like a shift change, to the sound of Molly screaming. Not crying, screaming, the kind of sound that goes straight past your thinking brain and into your spine. And I was out of bed and down the hall before I'd fully processed being awake. Her door was locked from the inside. I want to be very clear about this, because I checked the lock myself the week before, curious about an old brass mechanism that seemed almost decorative, and I know for a fact it could only be locked from inside the room, by someone reaching up. And Molly, at 7, could not reach the lock without standing on something. I put my shoulder into the door, twice before it gave. Molly was sitting up in bed, still screaming, both hands pressed flat against the wallpaper beside her headboard. And where her hands touched the wall, the faded blue flowers had started to bleed. Not literal blood. I want to be careful here, but a kind of dark stain spreading outward from her fingertips into the old paper, like ink dropped in water, forming shapes that resolved. For one sick half-second, before I grabbed her and pulled her away, into something that looked unmistakably like a small handprint that was not hers. Smaller, a child's hand, pressed into the wall from the other side. Renee was screaming Molly's name from the doorway. I got my daughter out of that room, and I did not let her sleep in it again. Not once, not for the remaining 4 months we lived in that house, and I want you to sit with that number for a second. 4 months. Because that's how long it took me to get my family out of a house I knew, with absolute certainty after that night, was actively, malevolently haunted. 4 months. If you're wondering why anyone stays in a house like that once they know, the answer is the same. Boring, human answer it always is. Money, and the specific kind of denial that comes from not having enough of it. We had sunk our savings into the down payment. We had nowhere else to go. And, Renee, this is the part I still have trouble forgiving myself for not seeing sooner. Renee had started to change in a way that made leaving even harder, because she had started to not want to. The next morning, I did what I should have done the first week. I researched the house's history. County records, old newspaper archives at the library, a very reluctant conversation with an elderly woman 2 houses down named Pat Halloway, who'd lived on Maple Hollow Road since 1974, and who, when I told her our address, went quiet on her porch for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You're in the Kessler house," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Can you tell me what happened there?" "I can tell you what people say happened. Whether it's true, I couldn't tell you. I wasn't in the house. What people said happened was this. The Kesslers moved in 1979 with 2 children, Abigail and her older brother Thomas. By most accounts, they were an ordinary family. Church-going, well-liked. The father worked at the mill in town. In the winter of 1980, Abigail, who was 9, died in her sleep. The county coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined, which in a small town in 1980 could mean almost anything, from an undiagnosed heart condition to something the coroner simply couldn't or wouldn't name. Pat told me, and this is the part where her voice dropped even over the phone, even 4 decades removed from it, that the rumor at the time was that Abigail hadn't died in her sleep, so much has been found that way, mouth open, eyes open, in a room that was, according to the one deputy who'd talk about it years later after a few drinks. Cold in a way a room shouldn't be cold in December. When the furnace was running fine, the family stayed another 2 years. Thomas, the older brother, began having what his parents described to neighbors as spells. Moments where he'd stop mid-sentence and stare at empty air, or wake screaming about his sister standing at the foot of his bed. In 1982, Thomas drowned in the pond behind the property. The official finding was accidental death. He was 14. His parents left the house within the month and never returned to collect the rest of their belongings. A cousin came for the furniture. The house went to the bank and then over the following decades through a string of owners who each left within a year or 2. None of them, as far as Pat knew, for reasons anyone ever fully explained. The last family before the county took it in '87 left in the middle of the night, according to Pat, without notifying anyone, without a for sale sign, without a word. They just left the door unlocked and drove away. "Why didn't the real estate listing mention any of this?" I asked her, though I already knew the answer. "Because nobody would buy it if it did," she said. "You didn't ask, did you?" I hadn't asked. I'd been so relieved by the price, so desperate for a fresh start for my family, that I hadn't asked the one question that would have saved us. Why is it so cheap? There is always an answer to that question, and it is never a good one. I wasn't satisfied with what Pat had told me. Rumors are one thing. A paper trail is another, and I've always been the kind of person who needs to see a document before he'll fully believe a story. Even a story he's already living inside of. The next afternoon, while Renee took Molly to a friend's birthday party, one of the last normal, uncomplicated afternoons we'd have for a long time, I drove to the county records office, and then to the local library, which kept a modest but complete archive of the town's weekly newspaper, going back to the 1950s on microfilm nobody had bothered to digitize. The clerk at the records office, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, pulled up the property history for 114 Maple Hollow Road without any particular reaction, until he got to the ownership timeline and went quiet in a way that made me lean forward. "Huh," he said, "that's a lot of turnover." He printed it for me without my having to ask. 11 owners since 1979, not counting us. An average of just under 4 years per owner, though that average was misleading, because several of the transfers happened within a single calendar year, sales so fast they barely registered as anyone having lived there at all. 2 of the transfers were foreclosures. One was a quitclaim deed transferring the property directly to the county, dated March of 1987, with no sale price listed at all. The deed the county used, I assumed, to simply take custody of a house nobody wanted and nobody would buy. Until eventually, decades later, somebody did. The microfilm archive was slower going, and mostly useless. The Kessler family story hadn't been considered newsworthy enough for more than 2 short items. One reporting Abigail's death in the flat. Procedural language small-town papers, used for anything involving a child. Found unresponsive in her bed, the morning of December 3rd. Pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death pending autopsy. And a second, 18 months later, covering Thomas's drowning with slightly more detail. Because a 14-year-old boy, drowning in a shallow pond in November, was, apparently, strange enough to warrant a follow-up quote from the sheriff's department. The quote, "When I finally found it, unspooling reel after reel of degraded film under a scanner that smelled like hot dust, made my hands go cold on the machine's control knob. There were some things about the scene that didn't sit right with me." The deputy, a man named Roy Elsher, was quoted as saying, "But the coroner ruled it accidental, and I've got no evidence to say otherwise. I'll just say I've pulled people out of that pond before and since, and I've never seen anybody go in wearing their church shoes buttoned all the way up, like he'd walked in on purpose, instead of falling. Buttoned all the way up." I sat with that phrase for a long time, before I could make myself keep reading, because it meant something specific and terrible that the newspaper article never said outright and didn't have to. Thomas Kessler hadn't fallen into that pond by accident. He'd walked into it, dressed deliberately, the way you'd dress for something you'd decided was important. A funeral, a church service, an ending, and nobody, not the coroner, not the sheriff's department, not the newspaper, had wanted to say the word that fit that image. So they'd called it accidental instead, and closed the file and let the family leave town in the middle of the night without ever having to answer the question. Of what exactly a 14-year-old boy thought he was walking toward when he waded into cold water in his good clothes and didn't come back out. I found one more thing on that reel, almost by accident, scrolling past it before some instinct made me stop and scroll back. A letter to the editor, printed about 4 months after Thomas's death, unsigned, which the paper had apparently run anyway despite its own policy, printed in full under the header, "A concerned neighbor writes." It was 3 sentences long. I copied it into my phone, word for word, and I have read it more times since than I can count. Something in that house on Maple Hollow does not want to be alone. It has taken 2 children already, and I do not believe it intends to stop at 2. Somebody in this town needs to say so before another family moves in not knowing. Nobody had said so. Or if they had, nobody had listened, the way nobody had listened to us when we should have asked Gary Prell one more question before we signed anything, the way I suspected. Nobody would listen to the next family either, because there is a particular kind of denial that operates at the level of an entire town, not just an individual family. A shared, silent agreement to let a bad thing become a rumor, and let the rumor become a shrug, and let the shrug become, eventually, nothing at all, just a low price on a listing that everyone quietly understands not to ask too many questions about. I told Renee everything that night, sitting at the kitchen table with Molly asleep. Finally asleep, on the living room couch, where she'd been sleeping since the incident in her room, under a blanket and a nightlight and my explicit instruction that one of us stay awake and watch her in shifts. I expected Renee to react the way I had, with fear, with urgency, with an immediate need to start packing. Instead, she went very quiet, and then she said something that still, to this day, is the sentence that frightens me most out of everything that happened in that house. "I think I already knew that," she said. "I think she told me." "Who told you, Renee?" "Abigail." I want to describe what happened to my wife over the following weeks as carefully and honestly as I can, because I think it's the part of this story people are least likely to believe, and it's the part that haunts me the most, in the literal sense of that word. It is the thing that follows me into rooms, into silences, into the 3 in the morning hour that I will never again be able to sleep through, peacefully as long as I live. Renee began talking to Abigail the way you'd talk to a close friend. Not dramatically, not in some trance state you'd see in a movie. She'd just mention things casually, the way you'd mention a conversation you'd had with your sister. Abigail says the weather's going to turn cold early this year. Abigail doesn't like it when you leave the porch light on. At first, I thought this was some kind of coping mechanism, a way of processing the fear by making the source of it into something manageable, something with a name and a personality, instead of an unknowable force in the walls. I have since learned that this is exactly the mechanism these things use, and that it works precisely because it looks like coping. It looks like getting better. It is, in fact, the opposite. Renee began spending time in Molly's old room, the room we'd forbidden Molly from sleeping in, alone, with the door shut, for stretches of an hour or more. I'd find her sitting on the floor near the closet, not doing anything, not reading, not on her phone, just sitting, sometimes with her lips moving slightly, no sound coming out. "What are you doing in here?" I asked her, the third or fourth time I found her like that. "Talking to Abigail. She's lonely, Danny. She's been alone in this house for 40 years. Can you imagine that? 40 years and no one to talk to who could actually hear her. Renee, this isn't a person. This is not a lonely little girl who needs a friend. Something happened to that child, and something happened to her brother. And I don't think either of those things were accidents." "You don't know that." "I know that 2 children from the same family died in this house within 2 years of each other, and every family after them left within a year or 2 of moving in. And you are telling me you've been having conversations with the ghost of one of those dead children in the room where she died." Renee looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since before Molly was born. A kind of calm, settled clarity that I mistook for one terrible moment for her finally seeing sense. I understand now that it was the opposite. It was the calm of someone who had already made a decision and was done arguing about it. "She's not going to hurt Molly," Renee said. "She likes Molly. She told me so. She just wants a friend. Is that so hard to understand? She's a little girl, Danny, a scared little girl who died alone and has been alone ever since." There was a night near the end of November that I haven't told anyone about, not even Dr. Voss. Not in full. I want to put it here, because I think it belongs here, chronologically and otherwise, even though I still don't fully understand what I saw, or whether "saw" is even the right word for it. I'd started sleeping on the couch in the living room by then. Partly to be closer to Molly, who was sleeping on the love seat across from me most nights rather than alone in the guest room, and partly because Renee had started staying up later and later, sitting alone in the kitchen with the lights off, and I had run out of ways to convince her to come to bed that didn't turn into an argument. Neither of us could win. Around 2 in the morning, I woke. Not from any sound, which was itself strange, because by then I'd trained myself to wake at the smallest creak, and found the living room considerably colder than it should have been. Cold enough that I could see my breath in the dim glow of the streetlight through the curtains. Molly was asleep, curled up under her blanket, and for one terrible second I thought I saw a second, smaller shape lying beside her on the love seat, tucked against her back the way a sibling might curl up during a sleepover. Pale, indistinct, gone the instant I sat up and my eyes adjusted fully to the dark. I want to be honest that I cannot swear to what I saw. I had been sleeping poorly for weeks by then, and I know that sleep deprivation does strange things to perception, lets the mind fill gaps with shapes it's been dreading. But I also know that Molly, when I gently shook her awake to move her to my side of the room, murmured something without fully waking, her eyes still closed, in a voice thick with sleep. "Tell her she can't come to my new bed, just the old one." I didn't ask her what she meant in the morning. She didn't remember saying it, and by then I had learned enough to know that asking would only frighten her without giving either of us any useful information, and that the things she said in her sleep seemed to come from somewhere that had nothing to do with what she consciously understood or remembered. Around the same time, small physical details started accumulating that were harder to write off individually, but impossible to ignore in aggregate. The temperature in the old bedroom, Molly's original room, stayed noticeably colder than the rest of the house, no matter what we did with the thermostat or the vents. I checked twice with a cheap infrared thermometer I bought specifically for the purpose, and the wall behind, where the bed had been consistently read, 8 to 11 degrees colder than the wall 6 feet away. A discrepancy. An HVAC technician I hired to look at it, under the pretext of a draft, could not explain, and seemed visibly unsettled by, checking his own equipment twice before writing, unable to identify source on his invoice and leaving faster than the job should have taken. The dog next door, a normally friendly Labrador named Biscuit that Molly used to wave to over the fence, stopped coming anywhere near our property line sometime in late November, and would bark, low and continuous, at nothing visible whenever anyone stood in our driveway after dark. Renee's sister, visiting for a single afternoon in early December, left 3 hours early, citing a headache, but called me 2 days later, once Renee wasn't in earshot, to ask, carefully, whether everything was okay, because she said she'd felt like she was being watched the entire time she was in the house. Like there was a kid standing just behind me every time I turned my back, except there wasn't. I did not sleep that night or many nights after that. I began, quietly, making calls to a realtor about listing the house, to my brother in another state about the possibility of staying with him temporarily, to a therapist I found through a hasty internet search specializing, according to her website, in families experiencing unexplained distressing phenomena, a phrase so carefully neutral it told me she'd dealt with this before and had learned the hard way exactly how much specificity a client could handle before bolting. Her name was Dr. Elaine Voss, and she was the only person in this entire story who believed me immediately, without hesitation, without the careful, patient skepticism I'd expected, and honestly would have understood. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in my car in the driveway because I didn't want Renee to overhear, and I got about 4 sentences into describing the house before she stopped me. "Has your wife started to identify with the entity?" she asked, speaking as though it confides in her, spending time alone in the space where the manifestations are strongest. I felt something in my chest go cold and loose at the same time, the specific horror of hearing a stranger describe your private catastrophe from a script. "Yes, all of that. How did you know?" "Because it's not uncommon, unfortunately, in cases like this," she said. "What you're describing isn't friendship, Mr. Ashworth, and I want you to hear me say that clearly, because I suspect your wife would disagree with me. And I suspect that disagreement is going to be the hardest part of what comes next. Entities like this, and I use entity as a functional term, not a metaphysical claim, because frankly, at this point in my career, I've stopped needing to know what they technically are in order to know what they do. Entities like this do not form attachments the way people do. They find the person in the house who is most isolated, most exhausted, most quietly desperate for connection, and they make themselves indispensable to that person. It's not malice in the way you or I would recognize malice. It's closer to how a parasite selects a host. Your wife isn't being tricked by a lonely little girl. She's being cultivated. Cultivated for what? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected. In the cases I'm familiar with," she said finally, "the entity's goal is almost always the same. It wants a permanent resident. It wants someone who won't leave. The Kessler girl didn't leave that house when she died, Mr. Ashworth. I don't think she has any intention of ever leaving, and I think she's decided that if she can't have her own family back, she'll take yours." I asked her what we should do. She was very direct. "Get your family out of the house. Immediately. All 3 of you. And do not go back in for any reason, including to collect belongings without support." By which she meant, though she was careful about how she phrased it over the phone, some combination of a cleansing ritual, a priest, or in the cases she'd seen resolve most cleanly, simply never going back at all and treating the house as a total loss. "What if my wife won't leave?" Another pause. "Then you may be facing a choice between your wife and your daughter's safety, Mr. Ashworth. And I am sorry to say that.
But I would be doing you a disservice if I let you believe there was a version of this, where you get to keep both without a fight.
I did not want to believe her. I spent the next week trying to find a version of the story where I didn't have to. I tried talking to Renee again, gently this time, framing it not as an argument but as a concern. The way you'd talk to someone you suspected of being in an emotionally abusive relationship, because by then that's exactly what I believe was happening.
Just with a participant who had died 40 years earlier and had apparently spent every one of those years learning how to make herself irresistible to the right kind of loneliness. It didn't work. Renee had an answer for everything. Abigail wasn't dangerous. She was misunderstood. Abigail hadn't hurt Molly. Molly had just been frightened by something she didn't understand. The way children are frightened by things that turn out to be harmless once you get to know them. Every argument I made, Renee had already had it, apparently, in conversation with a 9-year-old ghost, and had already resolved it in the ghost's favor. Dr. Voss put me in touch with a man she called, without any apparent irony, a colleague who works the parts of this I don't. His name was Marcus Feld, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, who arrived at our house on a Thursday evening in early December, wearing ordinary clothes, carrying nothing more dramatic than a canvas duffel bag, and who spent the first 20 minutes simply sitting in our kitchen, asking questions, before he ever set foot upstairs. "I need you to understand something before we start," he told me. Once Renee had reluctantly agreed to let him try. Reluctantly, because by then she had begun, in the specific quiet way she'd been changing, to treat any effort to help us as a kind of assault on Abigail. What I do isn't always permanent, and it isn't always total. Sometimes it moves a presence out of a house and it doesn't go anywhere exactly. It just goes quiet for a while.
The way a fire goes to embers instead of going out. And I need you to understand that the strength of an attachment like the one your wife has formed matters more than almost anything else I can bring into that room. If she doesn't want it gone, on some level, underneath whatever she's telling you and telling herself, then what I do tonight might not hold.
We went upstairs together. Marcus, myself, and Renee, who came along mostly, I think, because she didn't trust what might happen to the room if she wasn't there to advocate for its occupant. Molly stayed downstairs with the babysitter Dr. Voss had arranged, a soft-voiced woman named Carol who, we later learned, had done this exact job, minding a frightened child downstairs while adults dealt with something upstairs, more times than either of us wanted to ask about. Marcus worked methodically, without theatrics, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize, moving a small brass sensor through the air of the room in slow, deliberate patterns. And for the first 10 minutes, nothing happened at all, which felt almost more unsettling than if something had. The temperature in the room, which I'd measured obsessively for weeks by then, held steady, unnaturally steady, the way a held breath is steady. Then, the temperature dropped, fast enough that I watched the reading on my little infrared thermometer fall 12 degrees in under a minute. And Renee, who had been standing quietly by the door with her arms crossed, made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not quite a sob, not quite a word, something in between. And she took a step toward the center of the room, toward Marcus, with an expression on her face that I can only describe as pleading, though I couldn't tell, in the moment, who or what she was pleading with. "Don't," she said. "Please don't. She's not doing anything wrong. She's just a little girl. Mrs. Ashworth, I need you to step back toward the door. You don't understand what you're doing to her." The wallpaper along the far wall, the same faded blue flowers still bearing the faint shadow of the stain from that first terrible night, a stain that never fully washed out, no matter what we scrubbed it with, began to ripple very slightly, the way fabric ripples in a breeze that shouldn't exist in a room with the windows shut. And Marcus's voice, which had been calm and even the entire time, sharpened into something with real urgency behind it. "Daniel, get your wife out of this room, now." I got Renee out into the hallway, holding her by both arms while she struggled against me with a strength that frightened me more than anything the house had done directly. Because it wasn't the strength of a woman fighting her husband. It was the strength of someone fighting for something they believed, with total conviction. They could not survive losing. Through the open door, I watched Marcus continue his work, watched the sensors smoke, bend, and curl in patterns that had nothing to do with any air current in that room. Watched him say something final, sharp, and absolute in that same unfamiliar language, and then the room simply went still. The temperature climbed back to normal over the following minute, slow and steady like water finding its level. Marcus came out 15 minutes later, gray in the face, moving like a man who'd just carried something heavy up a long flight of stairs.
"It's quieter," he said. "It's not gone. I want to be honest with you both about that because I promised I would be. Something that strong, that established, over that many decades. I moved it back, I gave you some room, but I did not remove it, and I don't believe I could have. Not in one visit. Possibly not ever. Not without a great deal more than I have with me tonight. What I can tell you is that whatever ground I bought you, I'd use it. I wouldn't wait. I'd use every day of that room I just bought you to get your family out of this house, because it will come back to full strength, and when it does, it's going to remember exactly who tried to make it leave."
I asked him about Renee, whether what he'd done upstairs would help her, whether the attachment Dr. Voss had described might loosen now that its source had been, in his words, pushed back. He looked at Renee, still standing beside me in the hallway, quiet now, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the closed bedroom door with an expression I couldn't read.
"That part," Marcus said, "isn't really about the house anymore. That part is about her. I can weaken what's on that side of the connection. I can't do anything at all about what's on this side of it. That's between the two of you, and whatever help she's willing to accept from people who are actually still alive."
Renee didn't speak again that night. She let me put her to bed, and she slept, actually slept, for the first time in weeks. No sleepwalking, no murmured conversations with the ceiling. And for about 3 days after that, I let myself believe we'd turned some kind of corner, that Marcus's visit had done more than buy us a little quiet, that maybe we could stay, maybe we could fight this thing to a stalemate and live some kind of life in that house after all.
The way you might learn to live in a town that floods every few years, cautious, prepared, but not driven out entirely.
I was wrong. The quiet Marcus bought us didn't last 3 days. It lasted exactly until the night I've already told you about. The night I found Renee on the floor of that room with the window open in December,
mid-conversation with something that had, by then, learned exactly how to wait out a temporary setback. The end came faster than I expected after that. And it came on a night I have replayed in my mind so many times that I sometimes lose confidence in which details are memory and which are the version my exhausted, traumatized brain has reconstructed. To make the unbearable slightly more bearable, I'll tell you what I remember, and you can decide for yourself how much of it to believe. God knows I go back and forth on it myself.
It was the second week of December, 4 days before I'd finally convinced Renee to at least think about temporarily staying at my brother's while we figured things out. A small, hard-won concession that I'd been treating like a lifeline. I woke at 3 a.m., which by then was less an alarm clock than a summons, and found Renee's side of the bed empty. I found her in Molly's old room. The door, which we'd taken to keeping locked with a keyed deadbolt I'd installed myself, was standing open, the lock intact, the mechanism untouched. She hadn't unlocked it. It had simply not been locked
when it needed to not be locked, which is a distinction that only makes sense if you accept that the house itself, or whatever ran the house, decided when doors worked and when they didn't.
Renee was sitting on the floor in the center of the room, in her nightgown in December, with the window open and the cold pouring in. And she was talking. Not to empty air, the way she had before, but in a low ongoing murmur, back and forth, the cadence of an actual conversation. pausing at intervals as though listening to a response I couldn't hear. And Molly was standing in the doorway behind me. I hadn't heard her come up the stairs. She was in her pajamas, barefoot on the cold hallway floor, and she was looking past me, into the room, at her mother, with an expression of pure, uncomplicated, 7-year-old terror. "Daddy, why is Mommy talking to the girl in the wall?"
I want you to understand what that sentence did to me. Not the girl in my room, not the girl who used to live here. The girl in the wall, present tense, ongoing, as though the wall itself were a kind of container, a place where something could be stored and accessed. And my daughter, who had no context for any of the conversations Renee and I had had about Dr. Voss's theory of cultivation and permanent residency, had somehow arrived, on her own, at a description that was, if anything, more precise than the one the therapist had given me. I picked Molly up and carried her back to her new room. She'd been sleeping in the guest room since November, and I told her to stay there, under the blanket. And I went back for Renee. She wouldn't come. I want to be honest that this is the part where I stopped being gentle, where I grabbed my wife's arm hard enough to leave a mark and pulled her, physically, out of that room while she screamed at me. Not screamed in fear, screamed in fury. The specific fury of someone being separated from something they decided, with total conviction, that they needed. "You're going to ruin everything," she said, once we were in the hallway, her voice raw. She trusted me. Do you understand what that means? 40 years and no one trusted her, no one believed her, and I was the first person who did, and you just dragged me out like she's nothing. Like she's not real. She's not a person, Renee. Whatever she is, she's not a 9-year-old girl who needs your friendship. She's something that's been in these walls for 40 years, learning how to get someone to stay. You don't know that. I know 2 children are dead. I know every family who's lived here since has left within a year. I know our daughter said, "the girl in the wall," Renee, present tense, like it's still happening. Because it is still happening. And I am not going to lose you and Molly both to a house. She didn't answer me. She just looked at the closed bedroom door for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and something in her face. I want to say it was recognition, some flicker of the woman I'd married finding her way back to the surface for just a second. Softened. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." We left 3 days later. I wish I could tell you it was clean, that we packed our things calmly and drove away and never looked back. But the truth is we left most of what we owned behind because by the 3rd day Renee had started sliding back. Small things at first, a comment here, a long silence there, and I was terrified that if we stayed one more night, I would lose the small progress we'd made in getting her to agree to go. So we packed 2 suitcases and left everything else. Including furniture, including boxes we'd never fully unpacked, including, I realized only later, the specific cast iron skillet that had been my grandmother's, which I still think about sometimes, an absurd small grief riding on top of a much larger one. We didn't go to my brother's. We went to a motel 2 towns over, and then, once I was confident Renee had put enough physical distance between herself and that house to start thinking clearly again, we found a rental apartment in a different school district entirely. Far enough that Molly would have to switch schools. Close enough that we could still reach my job without a 2-hour commute. The house went back on the market within a month. I know this because I checked obsessively for weeks, the way you check on a wound to see if it's healing, except I wasn't checking to see if the house was okay. I was checking to see if anyone else had walked into what we'd walked into.
Gary Prell, the same agent, relisted it at a price even lower than what we'd paid. The listing photos were the same ones from before, taken, presumably, in some earlier period, when the house had briefly been vacant and photogenic and unhaunted looking, if such a period had ever really existed. I don't know who bought it after us. I hope, whoever they were, they asked the question we didn't ask. Why is it so cheap? Renee is better now mostly. It's been a year and a half.
She sees Dr. Voss regularly, and she doesn't talk about Abigail anymore. Not in the present tense, not in any tense. She's built a wall around that entire period of her life that I think is less about forgetting and more about survival. The same way you don't talk about a car accident you were lucky to walk away from. Not because you've forgotten it, but because talking about it means feeling again.
Exactly how close you came to not walking away at all. Molly doesn't remember most of it. Children are merciful that way sometimes, or maybe it's just that 7-year-old memories are porous, and the mind does what it needs to do to keep moving forward. She remembers the house as the scary one, and she doesn't like it when we drive anywhere near that side of the county, and that's the extent of it as far as I can tell. I've decided not to ask her more than that. Some doors, I've learned, are better left shut, even in conversation. As for me, I still wake up at 3 a.m. more nights than not, in our new house, in a town 40 minutes from Maple Hollow Road. And I still lie there, listening, the way you'd listen for a sound you already know isn't coming, because some part of my brain will never fully believe that. I check the corners of every rented room I've stayed in since. I ask now, whenever anything seems too good to be true, exactly why it's so cheap. And I have never once accepted an answer that made me comfortable enough to stop asking follow-up questions. I called Pat Halloway again, about 6 months after we left, mostly because I needed to talk to someone who understood, someone who hadn't been in the house herself but who'd watched families come and go from it for almost 50 years and had never once in all that time needed anyone to convince her it was real. "How many families total?" I asked her. "Since the Kesslers?" She was quiet for a while. "I stopped counting somewhere around the 8th or 9th one," she said. "It just seemed easier that way. You start to feel a certain amount of responsibility, watching it happen over and over and never being able to warn anyone in time. Easier not to count. Do you think it'll ever stop? The house, I mean. Do you think whatever's in there will ever just leave or fade or whatever these things do eventually?" "I think," Pat said, slowly, choosing her words the way you'd choose steps across a frozen pond, testing each one before committing your weight, "that something that's spent 40-some years learning exactly how to make people stay isn't going to get worse at it. I think it's going to keep getting better. I haven't been back to Maple Hollow Road since the day we left. I don't intend to. But I still think about that pale yellow house sitting at the end of its long dirt driveway, patient, updating its methods with each family that walks through the door, learning, the way anything learns, from every failure and every near success, waiting for the one family that won't figure it out until it's too late to leave."
There's one more thing I have to tell you, and I've gone back and forth for a long time about whether to include it because I don't have an explanation for it, and I've learned by now that the things I can't explain are the ones that frighten me most, more than anything the house ever did to us directly while we lived inside it. About 4 months after we moved into the new place, a plain, unremarkable rental with vinyl siding and a small backyard, a house with, as far as I could find out, no history worth mentioning, which had become, by then, one of the primary criteria I used when evaluating any property. Molly asked me out of nowhere over dinner whether Abigail was going to come visit for her birthday. I set my fork down very carefully and asked her what she meant. "She said she'd come see me on my birthday. She promised." "When did she say that, sweetheart?" Molly shrugged, the way kids shrug at questions that seem obvious to them and confusing that anyone would need to ask. "She talks to me sometimes. Not like she used to talk to Mommy, just little stuff. She says she misses her room." I want to be clear that Molly had not, as far as either Renee or I could determine, had any unusual sleep disturbances since we'd left the house. No sleepwalking, no strange nighttime murmuring, nothing that would have suggested any ongoing contact. This was, as far as we could tell, an entirely new development, arriving without warning, 4 months and 40 miles removed from the source, in a house that had never, to our knowledge, had any connection to the Kessler family or to Maple Hollow Road at all. I called Dr. Voss the next morning. She was quieter than usual on the phone, and when she finally spoke,
She chose her words with the same careful precision Marcus had used the night he'd warned me that what he'd done might not hold. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," she said. "Has Molly ever, at any point, said Abigail's name unprompted? I mean, without you or Renee having said it first in front of her recently, without her having overheard a conversation about it?" I thought back. Molly had known the name for months, obviously, from the countless conversations Renee and I had had within earshot. Some careful, some not careful enough. But this felt different. Not a fact she was repeating, but a claim of ongoing contact. Present tense. The same present tense that had chilled me the night she said, "the girl in the wall."
I don't know how to answer that in a way that would satisfy either of us, I told Dr. Voss honestly.
Then let me tell you what I think, with the caveat that I could be wrong, and I very much hope I am. I think what attached to your wife in that house was drawn initially to her loneliness. But I think somewhere in those months, it also took an interest in Molly, the way anything that's spent 40 years mimicking childhood might take an interest in an actual living child, especially one close in age to what it once was. I think Marcus's work weakened its hold on the house, and possibly weakened whatever connection had formed with your wife. I don't know that it did anything at all to sever a connection that may have already been forming, quietly, with your daughter, independent of the house itself.
Are you telling me this thing can leave the house, that it's not tied to the property? I'm telling you, I don't know for certain, and anyone who tells you they know for certain in cases like this is usually selling you something. What I can tell you is that in the small number of similar cases I'm aware of, when an attachment forms with a child rather than an adult, it tends to be far more persistent and considerably harder to interrupt because children don't erect the same defense as adults do. They don't ask the entity uncomfortable questions the way your wife eventually did.
Even if it took her a long time to get there. They just make a friend. We didn't get an answer that satisfied either of us that day, or in the months that followed. Molly mentioned Abigail 3 more times over the following year. Always casually, always in passing, always in a tone so ordinary that it was almost more unsettling than if she'd been frightened. The tone of a child mentioning a friend from a summer camp the adults in her life had never met. Each time, we asked gentle, careful questions. And each time, Molly's answers were vague in a way that felt less like a 7-year-old's imprecision and more like something deliberately keeping its details soft-focused, unfalsifiable, impossible to pin down into a fact we could act on. The mentions have grown less frequent as Molly's gotten older. She's 9 now, the same age Abigail was when she died, a coincidence that I try very hard not to read anything into and fail, every single time, to fully succeed. Renee doesn't know I still track this. I keep a private note on my phone, dates and quotes, every time Molly says something that could, charitably, be explained as an overactive imagination, and could, uncharitably, be explained as something that followed us out of that house in a form Marcus's work was never designed to catch, because it was never really about a room, or a wall, or a house at all. It was about a lonely, dead 9-year-old girl, who had at some point in the last 40 years learned that the surest way to never be alone again was to become the kind of thing a lonely, living child would want as a friend, and to be patient, endlessly, generationally patient, until one came along who couldn't yet recognize the difference between a friend and a thing that had learned with terrible precision exactly how to look like one.
If you ever find a house that's too good to be true, priced at a fraction of what it should cost, in a market where nothing is ever priced that low without a reason, ask why. Ask before you sign anything. Ask before you let your daughter pick out her room, and if the agent won't go past the porch and won't quite meet your eyes when you ask about the house's history, do yourself a favor. Don't ask again later. Turn around and don't look back, and never, under any circumstances, let your family fall in love with a room before you know exactly what happened inside it.
We got out. Not everyone does. I think about the families before us, the ones Pat stopped counting, And I think about whoever's living there now, unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, believing, the way we did, that they'd found something rare and lucky and good. I hope they ask the question we didn't ask. I don't think they will. I don't think anyone ever does until it's already too late, and the girl in the wall already knows their names.